think I'm gonna start making my new bit, like writing checks for groceries when I go to the grocery store, because they'll still take it. Welcome back to this week's episode of What's Going On in My Brain, also known as The Soup of Wall Street. So lately, I've been spending a lot of time with old people. It's like the holidays, and I don't know, you guys all do that, I'm sure. And it's kind of made me think, like, you spend time with people who are in a different generation than you, they think a little different than you. And I've started to kind of realize that pretty much everybody in general indexes their entire life toward what the world was like when they grew up, or the world that they grew up in. How about that? Because two people could have grown up in the same time period and had completely different life experiences, right? We agree on that. But like, everybody is just nostalgic for the world that they grew up in, and it never seems to change for like any generation. Now, I don't think that's a new idea, by the way. Like, I think that's pretty well documented. That shouldn't be a new idea for anybody. If it is, just like go read a book. But let me tell you what I think about this, because that's why you're here, to get some new insight, or because you like vehemently disagree with me, which is fine too. What I would like to think about is this idea of being really nostalgic for the world that you grew up in the context of money or business, and how that impacts the way that people make decisions today, and why we have these, multiple different generations trying to do things today and speaking completely different languages. Okay. Like, there's this idea that, a bottle of Coke should always cost the same as it did when you were a kid. I think that's like a Warren Buffett thing, maybe. He always says that. I don't know. He's a big Coke guy. And I think the idea is that like everybody remembers how much a candy bar cost when they were a kid, or a Coke or whatever. And they're always just so shocked when they see, oh, well, it costs so much now. Right. And that's everybody's way of kind of relating back to the world they grew up in and the world that we exist in today. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious. Everybody knows we're not going to go back to how the way the world worked 100 years ago. We just can't. But what I think we can do is take some of those mentalities, dissect them, and then understand why we have the problems we have today. How about that? Okay, maybe that's useful. So let's look at this. Let's start with our baby boomers. What I think is pretty interesting about this generation, because I feel like I spend a lot of time with people who are of this age, okay? 60, 70 years old. That's just my life. There's a lot of people who love to DIY everything. They love to do everything themselves. They grew up changing their own oil, making their own home repairs, all of these things. I mean, you talk to an entitled Gen Z or millennial who's never done thing like this in their life, right? And you have to realize there are pretty obvious forces at play here. And I don't think that people like actually are computing this. What do I mean? So 70 years ago, housing was really cheap, and services and stuff were expensive. That's how the world worked. So if you were growing up in the 60s or the 70s, and it was cheap to buy a house, but it was expensive to go buy a new part, or expensive to go pay somebody else to do it for you, what were you going to do? You lived in a nice big house, but you did everything yourself, right? It's not like we had TaskRabbit or Uber Eats or whatever. It's not like there was a giant convenience store every exit on the highway, right? You had to literally do all of this stuff yourself, which makes perfect sense when you think about this mentality. And it makes perfect sense why young people want to hire somebody on an app on their iPhone they've never met to do literally anything. Now, when you do that, you have a completely, let's say, variable outcome from the service that you're going to get. Like, I remember hiring people to move stuff into this house that I'm in, and they weren't even the same people that were like in the picture on the app that I hired. They looked completely different. Um, Definitely one of them didn't speak English. And then they like banged all my furniture throughout the walls and like chipped all this trim that I just been repainted and I still haven't fixed it. But it was way easier and cheaper for me to hire them than it was for me to figure out or go find one other person to help me and do it myself. Maybe I'm lazy. I don't know, but that's just the world I grew up in. And then now we see as people are getting older and they're dying off, we have these estate sales that are just like filled to the brim with stuff. You know what I'm talking about, like an estate sale in a fancy neighborhood of somebody who's old that died. And then you go in their house and they're trying to sell everything they own, right? And it's just filled with trinkets and stuff and you name it, like just the most useless things you could ever possibly imagine. Like, why would somebody ever buy this in the first place? It's because stuff was expensive and you never threw anything away. And by the way, if you were rich, how did you show that you were rich? Well, it wasn't by owning a super fancy house the same way it is today. I mean, yeah, sure, there's always going to be the outliers, but for the most part, that wasn't really the case. The way you did it was by owning that crazy stuff, showing off all the extra stuff that you had because nobody else could afford stuff. So go to an estate sale and then walk through it and be like, oh yeah, people actually spent real dollars on these and they kept them for their entire life. Kind of crazy when you think about it. I mean, you can think about this whole new like millennial minimalist vibe. You know, the memes or whatever that are on Twitter when they post it, and it's like a picture of like an empty apartment, and it's like, how rich do you have to be to own nothing, or something like that. There's that minimalism documentary, that insane one where they're like, you should literally throw away everything. I kind of get it a little bit, but also the reason they can say that in the context of 2024 or 2025 or whatever is because stuff is really cheap and it's fungible and it breaks and it's not expensive to go buy a new iPhone the same way it was expensive to, I don't know, maybe have a phone in your house in the first place 70 years ago or have a television. I mean, TVs are cheaper than they were 20 years ago, right? Now I have a freaking iPhone in my pocket that can connect me to literally anybody. It's kind of insane. The other thing that people say today that is in direct contrast with the way that people thought 50 years ago, especially the way that people who were boomers or from that generation would have thought, is they'll say outsource everything, right? We had an episode on this a few weeks ago where I was like, look, you should literally outsource everything except for your health and your relationships. Those are the only things you can't outsource. But literally anything else, why would it even be worth spending your time on it when you can get somebody else to do it who's probably better than you? The reason, okay, to do that today, and the reason we wouldn't have done that 50 years ago, is because labor is cheap and stuff is cheap. It's just true. You know, they talk about this whole idea of rising costs, rising labor, how labor's not keeping up, wages aren't keeping up with just the general rise in cost of living. Well, I can pretty much tell you why there's a cost of living increase. It's because everybody wants to live in a city, okay? Just look at the demographic trends for the last 50 to 75 years. Everybody's moved from the rural areas to the cities. I can guarantee you it is not as expensive to go live out in the country as it is to go live in the city, which is where literally everybody wants to live today. So there's way more demand there's ever been. It's really simple. More demand, costs go up. Okay? You can infinitely create stuff. That's what we do. This is America. We just infinitely create stuff, or we outsource to other countries and they infinitely create stuff for us. It's not like they're building more land. So we can build up, but depending on where you live, you might not be able to do that. And if you're supply constrained, guess what happens? Prices adjust. So it's really expensive to go live in a city, but on a relative basis, still labor and stuff is really cheap. Why is labor cheap, by the way? Because in order to live like a king today in 2024 or 2025, it's actually not that expensive. It's true. Your standard of living today is freaking insane. I'm going to tell you this. So I know there's a restaurant in Austin. I know it pretty well. And it's like, very fancy, white tablecloth, nice kind of restaurant. It's the restaurant where whenever somebody who's famous or celebrity, a rich person comes into town, they're going to eat at this restaurant. And I know a few weeks ago, there was a very well-known individual, a billionaire, who came and ate at this restaurant with his billionaire friend who was visiting in town. Okay, just the two of them. They spent $350 on dinner. They tipped $200 because they're billionaires, nice guys, and they left. They didn't get the caviar service. They didn't get the nicest bottle of wine. No, they went to a very nice white tablecloth restaurant, but they spent $350 on food, a couple drinks, and they left. Now, I realize $350 is a lot for dinner for two people. Most people aren't going to do that every night. In fact, I would say virtually nobody's going to do that every night. But that's not something that you couldn't go do once a year. Maybe a couple times a year if you're lucky, special occasion. The point is, you can have the same exact life experience, even if just for a few hours, as the, I'll say it, literal richest person on earth. The richest person on earth can go to a restaurant and have the exact same standard of living as you can for a few hours. So why is labor so cheap? Because it is cheap to spend our time the same way that the most powerful people on earth do. It's an absolute fact. Okay. Could we have done that 50 or 75 years ago? Maybe, in a different way, maybe. But I also know for a fact that all the richest people on earth have iPhones. It's not like there's some black box secret device that they're holding that only the rich people even know about. They freaking have iPhones, okay? Would you rather have like an iPhone that all the famous and rich people have in your pocket and access to the same information they do on a daily basis? Or would you rather have it be like 1950 where everybody can kind of live in a decent place, but like that's it? In a 1950s house with vinyl floors. Sorry. I lived in a house once that had vinyl floors. It was kind of weird. I'm sure they're fine. Really easy to clean up, Lots of interesting colors. And then, people always make the point about when they talk about this housing being cheap back in the day. They use Warren Buffett as an example, who's like a reasonable example. He bought a house in 1958. He still lives there today. Or at least he did. 1958, that house cost $31,000. He was 28 years old. $31,000. Wow, Obviously, you can't get a house for that anymore. But if you look at it in context, the average house that was being sold at that time was $11,000. So he still bought a nice house relative to other houses. Of course, this was in Omaha, Nebraska, not exactly like the capital of the world. You definitely probably could have bought a house in that neighborhood back then. It's not like today where, do you know how much it costs to buy a house on the lake in Austin? I'm not even going to tell you. Okay. Just go look it up. It's more than it used to though. It's way more than it used to. In fact, I'll say this. So I was talking to my friend who sells houses, some of them on the lake. We were at lunch the other day. Sells a lot of very nice houses. There's a lot of them in Austin. And I was like, hey dude, so he was showing me these $15 million houses. And I was like, what can you get for $15 million? And he was like, well, you can kind of get on the lake. That side of the lake is what he was saying. That was the insinuation. But he was showing me these $15 million houses, some of them on the lake, some of them weren't. And I just stopped in the middle of it. And I was like, dude, is a $15 million house worth it? And he was like, no, no, it's not. Because you can get the same quality of house, the same build for something way less than that. Okay? I always crack up whenever you go look at these, Selling Sunset or, these fancy new real estate shows. And I was talking to this lady at this appliance store who was showing me all the nice appliances you could buy in your house. Maybe I was going to buy some, maybe I wasn't. I don't know. And she was like, yeah, I watch these shows and I can always tell when they go cheap on the appliances, which is really funny to me, that you're going to spend $3 or $5 or $15 million on a house and then you're going to get kind of the shitty range, which means that myself, in my house that's not $15 million, I promise you that, could go get the same level or better in my appliance package than somebody who's going to spend $10 million or more. It's kind of a weird thing if you think about it, because I think that once people get, beyond a price point that is reasonable for like anything, for instance, so like $10, $25, something in that range is probably a reasonable price for lunch. Okay, you start spending more than that, $50, $100, you're paying for something else. You might get lunch with it, but you're paying for something else. Once you start spending more than, I'll even say a few $1 million on a house. Once you start spending more than that, you're paying for something else. Go walk down to the convenience store at the end of the street, and I give the guy $2, and he gives me a Diet Coke, and we're both happy because they got their $2 and I got my Diet Coke. I used to go to McDonald's. This is a true story. I used to go to McDonald's, 5 minutes from here. I would pay $1 for Coke, a Diet Coke, but $1. And then they changed it to $2, like overnight. And you know what I started doing? I literally went to Wendy's because Wendy's would sell it for $1. I'm not even kidding you. And guess what? The Wendy's Diet Coke was terrible. It doesn't taste the same. It was $1 instead of $2, but I didn't like it. So I wasn't very satisfied. So you know what? I literally went back to McDonald's so I could start having their Diet Coke, even though the price changed. And you know what? I was happy again. Okay. But that's the point. That's how an open market actually works. When you get to some of these like luxury products, I don't know, $5, $10, $15 million houses, you're not buying the house. You're buying something else. And by the way, the seller's not selling that house. They're selling something else. Usually they're selling like pride and emotion with it. So that's why you see these really big houses sit on the market for like years and years and years. How many stories have you seen of like celebrities who have sold their California mansion and, they list it for $40 million and then 3 years later it's still on the market. Now it's like 10. I mean, maybe I'm making those numbers up, but I'm probably pretty close on a lot of them. Because when you get to that price range, you're not really buying the mud and sticks and windows and appliances. You're buying something else. And when you look at where we are today in just the way that how much stuff costs in general, it's way different than where it was a long time ago. Today, the actual hard costs for stuff is cheap, for labor is cheap, for housing is expensive. But there's so many other things too. Information is cheap, technology is cheap. Like it's easier to access knowledge than it ever has been. And so how do universities and higher education institutions cope with that? They just make their prices more expensive. Why? So you can pretend like you're buying something else if you go to university. There has to be, right? Like if you're just paying for the education, you can go get that for free. So they have to be pricing something else. Travel is cheap. Travel is cheaper than it's ever been. Like it used to be a thing that people grew up and they didn't get on airplanes. Like I remember that narrative so much when I was super young. Like airplanes are expensive. Only rich people fly them. Only rich people do that. I think everybody knows that's not what rich people do. Everybody can get on an airplane. I mean, you're freaking chock full of, just load them up, Airplanes are so packed, jam-packed. Everybody gets on airplanes because they're cheap, right? Here's another thing that I think is interesting is debt is cheap. Like it's easier to access debt than it has been ever. Part of the reason that housing was cheap back in the day is because that was like the only place that most people could access debt, right? I buy a house, I can get a mortgage for that house. Therefore, I can go afford it. You couldn't get debt for anything else. So everything else by nature had to be cheap so that people could pay for it. Well, today, it's easier than ever to go get a credit card. Anybody practically can get a credit card, and anybody can max it out. So buying stuff is super easy. And I'm just so rarely impressed by the stuff that people can pay for, people can buy, because first off, I don't really care. Second off, anybody can max out their credit cards. It doesn't mean anything, you know? But back in the day, you couldn't just do that. You had to pay cash. You had to write a check. Ever write a check for something? Golly. I think I'm gonna start making my new bit, like writing checks for groceries when I go to the grocery store, because they'll still take it. Just kidding. That sounds terrible. And the reason stuff was so expensive is because people couldn't freaking pay for it. They couldn't access debt. Now anybody can get debt. So anybody can buy anything. Some of this stuff isn't rocket science, you guys. Okay, here's the deal. Things that are expensive though. How about this one? Relationships. Relationships are expensive. They require time and effort. Those are the things that we don't like to do because we have easy access to literally everything. I can hire somebody for my iPhone. I can be entertained for my iPhone. Trust is expensive. Why? Because information is cheap. So who can I actually trust? This stuff starts to make sense once you start to put it together, okay? Relationships are difficult. Trust is difficult. Not monetarily, it's just hard to come by. So you see marriages succeeding at a lower rate than they literally ever have. They say that you're a fool if you believe anything on the internet. Well, something must be true, right? No, just don't believe everything or anything. It's a wild time that we live in. It's just insane. I do think in the future, the things that are going to be revered, like kids growing up in a 2-parent household, that's literally going to be a status symbol in 20 years. I don't know. I'll say it. I think it's going to be a status symbol, or maybe it won't be directly a status symbol, but we'll be able to look back and say, dang, all the kids who Grew up and really kind of made it, it's because they grew up in a place that was stable, and they're going to have better opportunity because of that. They just will. If for no other reason, they'll have continuity of thought. Imagine bouncing from place to place to place, and some of y'all have done it, I'm sure, where just the ideologies and the stories you hear are constantly changing every single week or month or whatever. Just picking one thing and sticking to it matters a lot. At some level, I don't even care what you believe, quite honestly. Just believe something. Have I gotten too far? Anyway.